Thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction. And I also, the first thing I like to do is acknowledge the native people of this place, so the Pueblo people whose ancestors are buried in this land on which we stand, and thank those ancestors for letting us be here to do this good work. And I'd like to thank the gracious, generous people of the School for Advanced Research for allowing us to do this good work here, supporting our work, and providing this time for me to get back to this work that means so much to me and to my community. So I'm going to try not to adhere entirely to my notes. However, if I don't, I'll go down several rabbit holes probably, and so I'll try to mix it up a little bit. But it's important for me to first sort of let you know who I am and where I come from and why this work is so important to me. So my work over the last 18 years has sought to understand the role of the public narratives to define Native people. Today's presentation will explore those narratives and discuss them in two parts. The first segment, essentially chapters 1 through 5, outlines my dissertation work completed between 2005 and 2009, which examined the existing museum narratives of Native life in California. This segment will inform about 2/3 of my book manuscript to be published with the University of Nebraska Press. The second will outline the work in progress, which chronicles the efforts of Native people to rewrite these dominant narratives. I'm also deeply involved in that work, as I will discuss later. As you can see, I identify myself also as an artist and an activist, because these are also part of this holistic whole. That is who I am. So there are many things that inform my work, not only scholarship and research, but also some of the things that I'm going to talk about here today, which can be considered activism in some circles. So this is essentially the outline of my, currently, the outline of my, my book manuscript. So as you can see, chapters 1 through 5 are informed by the work, this first segment of the talk today, and then chapters 6 through 9, I'm going to discuss is really this new work that I'm writing about while I'm here at SAR. So informing the theoretical frame, I'm a mixed heritage woman descending from the indigenous people of the west coast of North America. Some of those ancestors have Spanish surnames, but I have not found yet one in my genealogy that arrived on a boat from Spain. We are indigenous to what I'm referring to here today as Greater California, my homeland, which spans the length of the coast, where the only border was between the earth and the sea. My mother was born and has deep roots in Montecito, California, and for generations spanning millennia, it has been the home to her family. I am a descendant of the people historically identified as coastal mainland Chumash, and an active member of this community in Santa Barbara. I could probably do better without these, actually. This connection allows me intimate familiarity with and knowledge of how representations of history impact our lives. I've seen over my lifetime how the public idea of what is and what is not Indian has impacted us. So although this project is based on observations over a 4-year period of field research, it has been informed and sits within the context of 50 years of experience. It should be said at the start, however, that this experience is the basis of my narrative strategy, and I do not at any time assert that my experience is the truth for all Native people or all Native people in California. Oftentimes, when you speak as a Native person, it is assumed that you're probably not in this group because you all are pretty well informed, I suspect. But it's assumed that you speak of the Indian experience, and my experience is my own. It's my own family and communities, but it's even differs from several of the experiences within my own family and within my own community. Initially, I did not intend to include the settler population representations in this study. My aim was to examine Native Californian representations and how they impact the Indian community. Over the course of my research, however, my own genealogical work deepened, revealing a hidden, equally strong ties to what is now Mexico, as well as Santa Barbara. Interviews with local Indian community members, too, revealed a level of ethnic mixing, which I had been unaware. I recognized then the need to address the identity issues around the ideas of Spanish and Mexican settlers, also called Californios. This fact revealed an additional issue with the portrayals of our histories as biologically and culturally distinct groups, a notion that has permeated our lives, is perpetuated by the public representations, and has resulted in division and animosity among extended family groups. Today, I will not be discussing in great detail the secondary literature, anthropological, and historical scholarship behind the current public history representations. Though some of that material is important for framing the purpose of my work, I will discuss today primary research and the work in my own community that is disrupting and subverting those popular academic and public histories. This work primarily is informed by my own experiences in the field. In 2004, during a Chumash Interpretive Center tour I was giving to 93rd graders, another person who worked there introduced me and said, "Deana's like an endangered species. We're encouraging her to reproduce so the Chumash don't go extinct." I had one of the teachers come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe," I continued the tour, but this is not an uncommon belief in Southern California that Native people are extinct or are going extinct, and I suspect that this idea, the pervasiveness of this idea, is partially informed by these public narratives that frame us in that way as extinct or nearly extinct. I spent a great deal of time thinking about how, as Native people, we're always in the field. Not privileged to extract ourselves from the rigors of research, we are the sites of research. Our embodied histories inform our day-to-day interactions. The more immersed we are in the scholarship, the more difficult to disengage from the digestion of constant incoming data. As a kid growing up in the urban sprawl of Los Angeles, in the colonized and reconfigured homeland of my people, to assert Native identity was an abstract concept. We weren't acknowledged as legitimate Indians. Nothing about my life in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley, affirmed my indigeneity, so none of us talked about it. We were truly assimilated. We were extinct by all anthropological definitions. As a young woman, I began to question these internal and external conflicts and to seek out elders who were willing and able to discuss our history. In 1997, I went to work for my tribe, a California state recognized but not federally recognized community of loosely connected extended family. I returned to school and set about learning all I could about our history and culture. So that's really, that defines the primary theoretical frame, right? This is the place I'm coming from. My graduate work from 2001 to 2008 was primarily informed by Indigenous Methodologies, a theory set forth by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, a Maori scholar, who spoke about, and I'll talk a little bit more about this and how it dovetails really nicely with grounded theory, but her work talks about how necessary it is for the community to inform the research questions and the research model, and how necessary it is to have that be a fluid experience, always engaging with the community to continue to drive the research. So based on community goals and community concerns, rather than the researchers. And then, literature, and this is all pretty, not outdated literature, but it shows you that I was actually conducting this work in the early 2000s. But this work is really quite deeply informed by museum studies scholarship, as well as anthropology and Native American scholarship, Native American studies scholarship as well. And then also Edward and Bonnie Duran's work on historical trauma, and Cynthia Wesley Eskimo also speaks about the way that public representations affect Native people and our sense of identity as Native. And then my work, the work that Michael spoke about, my curatorship at the Burke Museum and then my curatorship at the Portland Art Museum also informs this new work, because I was able to see during that time the impact that one person can have with strong allies and a clear focus for activism and mobilization and a commitment to providing voice to Native people. I was able to see that there's quite a lot of movement that can happen internally in the museum world when the institution is committed to seeing that happen. And then since I've been here, I've been reflecting quite a lot about the ongoing impacts of these representations on us, as almost like microaggressions, you know, re-traumatizing Native people again and again as we confront these really hard histories that are often represented in this skewed and misrepresentative way. So I've totally lost my place now in my paper. Let's see if I can wing it for a bit. So my dissertation research then is really looked at California Indian history. So the dissertation itself has a chapter on California Indian history, before and after European settlement, the history of museums and the development of the missions as these tourist sites, an analysis of 30 museums. So I did an initial survey of the museums on the central coast of California that represented Native people, and there were 54 institutions, and that includes all 21 of the missions, which does extend beyond the central coast. But the regional history, natural history, and science museums along the central coast, and then all of the missions comprise 54 institutions, and I didn't visit them and conduct research at all of them, but the 30 that do the most work teaching third and fourth graders about Indigenous history and settlement history in California to comply with the curriculum standards. The Museums everywhere are used to supplement curriculum standards, state curriculum standards, and that is also true for California. And then I interviewed Native people within that 4-county region, and to talk to them about those representations and whether or not they reflect their lives, the histories as they know them, and their lives today as contemporary Native people. What were the missing narratives? What kinds of stories are being told in the communities that aren't being told in the public history? And then I also looked at ways forward, ways that museums can more meaningfully work with Native people, and some of the stories that could be told that are actually part of the historic record that just seem to get ignored in the public realm. So as I spoke briefly, I really grounded. I really used the system of grounded theory in order to collect and analyze my data, and it dovetails really well with Indigenous methodologies in that in grounded theory, the data informs the questions, and so you have some loose ideas of where the project's going to go, but you really pay attention to what your data tells you. So you're collecting and analyzing data all the while you're developing those research questions, and they get clearer and clearer as you go on. This is just a little bit of the structure for what it does and then how the methods for going about collecting and analyzing that data, using codes and coming up with overarching concepts to analyze the data. Okay, let me get back to my notes. So, this is important. Shumash, he says, and when he says it, I think of ancient sea lion hunts and salt spray windswept across my face. They tell him his people are dead, terminated. It's official. U.S. rubber stamped, official Chumash, terminated. a people who died, they say, a case for the anthropologists. That's an excerpt from a book of poems by one of my aunties, Georgiana Sanchez. So along the central mainland coast of California, the indigenous population has most often been described as hunter-gatherer, first fisher peoples, who comprised mostly sedentary societies reliant on abundance of marine and terrestrial resources available. The Chumash, the Tongva also occupied the northern and southern Channel Islands, respectively. All of these groups had extensive trade networks that included coast and inland groups, facilitated in some areas by shell bead currency. Most archaeologists agree upon one of two theories: a migration to the area. Both are migration theories. One, crossing the Bering Land Bridge in search for big game, and the other a coastal migration along what they call the Kelp Highway. That one is actually gaining in popularity. And that one's actually more plausible. But all Native people in California and elsewhere have ancient oral histories that assert indigenous presence on the landscape. Great flood stories do talk about, the recession and the return of the seashore. But those stories, these great flood stories, are part of our long history of stories. They're not the beginning of life for us in that area. According to linguists, the predominant languages spoken were from north to south, Penutian, Hokan, and Uto-Aztecan. The area of concern for this study was the Aboriginal territory of the Ohlone, Esalen, Salinan, and Chumash, with slight inclusion of the southern groups Tongva, Juaneño, Luceño, Ahetramem, and Kumeyaay. The area constitutes the geographic region of the coastal plain, approximately 50 to 100 miles wide, and from San Francisco Bay south to the border of Mexico, though traditional Kumeyaay territory extended to below Ensenada, about 500 miles in length total. The pre-contact population numbers vary, but scholars have suggested there were approximately 100,000 people along the mainland central coast. One of the most densely populated regions in the U.S. due to the abundance of terrestrial and marine resources and extensive trade interactions. Life on the Central Coast was so abundant, in fact, that sophisticated maritime technologies and complex social networks, including artisan guilds, were developed over time. With the arrival of Junipero Serra and the Spanish mission system, an economic, I'm not going to go into great detail into this, but it was an economic endeavor that yielded millions of dollars from native labor between 1769 and 1833, and that's 18th century dollars. The decline of native life was extraordinary. The loss of culture and the fabric of native life devastating. What followed were two additional waves of colonial rule, Mexican and the US or American rule, that made destruction of culture nearly complete. Scholars have called the history of the settlement of California a hidden genocide. So it's 13,000 years of history in 3 minutes. Forgive me, ancestors. So the goals of my community in alignment with Indigenous methodologies. My aim as an Indigenous researcher, with my goals closely tied to the needs of my community, was to reveal in a systematic, quantitative, and well-grounded way what role, if any, museums and missions in coastal California have had in the continued denaturalization and alienation of us from the place that has been our home for at least 13,000 years, or time immemorial. It is clear from these images that the mission system had an incredibly devastating impact on Native life initially. But are these public history and educational sites still playing a part in keeping Native people invisible? As our birthright to live and thrive in these lands, it has been the primary goal of my community to reassert our presence. Determining what factors are impeding our progress has been primary. So as you can see, that what I call in the dissertation, the Indian Free Zone, the place where there are no federally recognized tribes, that spans from San Francisco all the way to San Diego, with the exception of Santa Ynez, and Santa Ynez is about 30 miles inland, but has a membership of 150 currently. And there are some 5,000 to 6,000 people who identify as coastal mainland Chumash. So you can see the impact that the mission system had on the the maintenance of cultural lifeways, the things that at a later time had to be used to prove that they were really Indian, right? Those things were almost entirely erased, language and cultural expression. Museums for centuries have controlled the gaze of the public. Volumes have been written too about how these public depictions serve to define memory for the average American. Today, though messages are typically more subtle, the control of the gaze still generally remains in the hands of the dominant class and ethnic group. In fact, discursive frameworks can be observed and decoded in any ethnographic museum about the society doing the representing. Holdovers from Pitt River's classificatory system of displaying artifacts in an evolutionary way to highlight the rise of civilization through the increased complexity in objects, for example, were designed to help Victorians understand the process of social evolution and to place their society at its pinnacle. Similar schemes can still be seen in many mainstream American facilities. In this way, museums continued to define the world for us. The modern museum traces its roots to the Enlightenment period. Scholars have cited 3 technologies of power: maps, censuses, and museums, as particularly influential on the modern period. The map has been used as a metaphor for the museum, as a system of ordering and classifying that shares many of the cultural and epistemological functions of geographical maps. Through the seemingly neutral and technical process of mapping, specific world pictures are constructed, and that constructed picture is understood as reality. Unfamiliar territory was both made familiar and claimed through the giving of names that placed the land within a known schemata. The museum, says Bennett, is designed to turn the visitor into a virtual witness to a history which essentially requires a map to navigate its terrain. Bennett says that methods of detective fiction are employed by museums to construct the crime on the basis of remnants, and that the narratives told in history venues are basically governed by the art of this backward construction. This process is essentially as he says, machinery of detective fiction, which is constantly backward glancing as it infers causes from their effects and makes visible the crime and its perpetrators from the traces he or she left behind, all the while moving the reader or the visitor forward in time and space. The narrative assigns the visitor a place and identity as a progressive, evolved subject in the ongoing advancement of humankind, which in its nature instantiates the ideology of progress. Museums historically construct meaning about and for others, and do so in very predictable ways. Dominant identity and racial discourses are embedded in such progress-oriented museum representations. In this way, museums in California construct historic narratives that depict local Native communities through the use of materials that belong to them and documents such as historic photographs and drawings. In so doing, these facilities codify certain stories as truths. Such truth, for example, is the portrayal of ethnic and cultural isolation between groups of Indians, Spaniards, Mexicans, and Americans. In fact, almost all history venues on the Central Coast employ a progress narrative, charting these racialized regimes of occupation through time. They all end with the pinnacle of progress, the Anglo-American. Contrary to this accepted vacuum-packed formula, my research within Central Coast Indian communities has revealed a much more complex and interesting story. Building upon these themes, cultural theory examines the relationship between what is made visible for and by whom it is created, and how seeing, knowing, and power are interrelated. Its premise is that cultural symbols have the power to shape cultural identities as both individual and at social levels, to mobilize emotions, perceptions, and values, to influence the way we feel and think. Many museum scholars recognize that history has become the knowledge or ideology of nationhood, and it's really what has just been selected, preserved, and popularized in the public memory, rather than any universal truth. Research and community work is needed to address such vagaries and inaccuracies around ideas of truth. In fact, most California museums provide a cogent example of the disconnection between scholarship and practice, including a deeply embedded attachment to the nostalgia and fantasy Spanish heritage. According to the work of Phoebe Kropp, Southern California's golden age offered a comforting past for Anglos, But Anglos did not inherit this past, they produced it. I would say that the same is true for Fiesta in Santa Fe. The Romantic version of history may not have been completely fabricated, but it still required interpretive work that smoothed out conquest, genocide, and war, as well as race, class, and religious conflict. By the late 1880s, thousands of Anglo settlers were arriving in California on pilgrimages to discover the romance of a place Helen Hunt Jackson's novel Ramona had instilled in them. The novel Jackson had hoped would bring attention to the abysmal conditions suffered by California Indians, which she discussed in detail for that purpose. Instead, the book conjured images of an Old West that attracted thousands seeking refuge from modernity. As I discuss the mission museums, you'll see the pervasive attachment to this nostalgic, perhaps invented past. Oh, that was the slide for that. So in terms of my data collection, how I set about addressing these questions was to visit these Central Coast museums, take photos, measure exhibit spaces, talk with people about what educational materials were used to deliver class, third and fourth grade class tours, and collect that literature. And then also conducted semi-structured interviews with staff and docents, as well as some participant observations. So what do they call it? I went on several of the tours and shadowed. Thank you. There's a docent in the room. And all the while conducting also these semi-structured interviews with Native people in that 4-county region, in that 4 tribal group area. And I also sent questionnaires to service agencies in the area. Since there are no federally recognized tribes along the coast, I had to get those questionnaires to places where urban Native people frequent, like the Indian Health Services in Santa Barbara. So as I said, as I was collecting the data, I was also analyzing and coding that material, returning to the community and asking more questions and analyzing that data. So it was a very fluid process between the data collection and data analysis. Some of the codes that emerged, and you'll see them, these portrayals represented pretty clearly in the imagery that I'm going to show you in a moment. But there was also a very strong component coming from the Native community that didn't have anything to do with the museum representations. In fact, it was counter to the museum representations about pride, about revitalization, about efforts at maintaining sacred sites and cemeteries, and for non-federally recognized tribes, those efforts have to be entirely grassroots, right? There's no funding, there's no land base, there's very little support. So I was fascinated and also empowered and inspired by these stories, and I'll speak to those a little bit here in a minute. So, of the 4 different types of museums that I visited, they were archaeological, natural history, anthropological, and the mission museums. And these are the dominant narratives in each of those. Very consistent. All of the archaeology museums that I visited had these themes really clearly emphasized. Declension, loss of life is primary. You never hear about who these people were beyond the particular era that they're focusing on. And so, as you can see, at the Albinger in Ventura, California, the Chumash actually only lived from 1500 to 1834. And I know they're trying to say something else, but it's important to read these things at face value. And often represented, right, with the materials that have come from the ground, right? They're archaeological museums, and so they're stone and bone and shell materials, and then and then these constructed dioramas as well, which primitive, static, this is, and it's so interesting to see the way that that Chumash life is always depicted just like that, just like that. If you look like this and you dress like this, it doesn't match up, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so in natural history museums, the one with nature emphasis, right? Native people are placed with the animals and bugs and the flora and fauna. Ahistorical, having the Indian people were always like this, as they are in their natural state, in their natural habitat. And it's really based on that ethnographic snapshot in time, right? It's based on those earliest encounters by the Europeans with coastal native people. Yeah, I won't go into all of that, but most of these representations, if they ever show an image or a representation of contemporary people, it's much marginalized and outside of the main exhibit. There is a 5x7 in this. The whole gallery space is dedicated to pre-contact Chumash life, and then there's one color image, a 5x7 image, and it's actually located down near the ground too. It's really easy to miss. At the science museums, though they have Native American curriculum, there is very little exhibits. At the Morro Bay Museum of Natural History, this guy is the only. I said no Native content except this guy, and obviously he's portrayed as a sort of stereotypical one with nature fellow with a bird wrapped around his waist. And Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History. As you can see, the Native Americans are with the butterflies, birds, and the staff call bell. Regional histories are much more celebratory, but they celebrate progress, and progress presumably is despite or outside of any Indian life. And so they usually begin with Native people and they end with Anglos, and they literally take you on a tour that starts with Native people. Oftentimes they're dimly lit, and they're stone bowls and the most primitive looking materials to represent Native life, and then in come the Spanish, and then the Mexican period, and then the Anglo period, and Native people are not represented beyond those. They often stem from local wealthy collections donated by the local wealthy, and those people are usually Anglos, and so the best materials are usually materials that represent the American period, right? This one, it even says this on the website. The exhibit begins with the Chumash and moves forward in time. This might be the very worst of them all. The Paso Robles Pioneer Museum even has a cigar store, a 4-foot cigar store Indian in the exhibit space. So the missions are especially interesting, and I actually, one of the articles that Michael mentioned is my mission, the chapter on the missions from my dissertation, which is called Nostalgia as Epistemology. So for decades now, 4th graders have been expected to construct sugar cube missions, usually one that resembles the mission in their particular school district. At each mission, any of you from California, remember this, I know you do. Is there anyone actually who, oh look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. Yeah, see? I've heard that they're moving away from doing that, but it's been happening for 40, 50 years. At each mission, there are models, cardboard cutouts, or tiny adobe replicas constructed by local fourth graders. These are usually complete with tiny artificial trees and foliage. Never, however, are there Indian people depicted in these models. The handsome buildings of white adobe and red tile roofs, which is interesting and very different from New Mexico. White adobe and red tile roofs, which have come to characterize Southern California, are shown as empty, vacant spaces, failing to recognize the builders. Probably the most subtle narrative in the museum, but the most profound to a native visitor, is the sense of isolation. Each mission is surrounded by people-less, pristine landscapes. The false facade covering every mission provides another metaphor for the erasure of Indian and Mexican narratives in favor of those that privilege whites. Adobe bricks are continually covered over by plaster to preserve the real adobe and present a more polished exterior. In some places, the adobe is completely gone and there is a false facade in its place. The original adobe, when it shows through, is very brown, and it has been covered over by layers and layers of whitened plaster. There's no accident about that. The overarching theme is Spain and ties to a white European past, suggesting to visitors that as a Spanish endeavor, the missions were built, guarded, and operated by Spaniards. Ironically, a very small number of the mission population was actually Spanish. The ethnic origins of Spain's colonizing force, the soldiers, were predominantly Mexican, Indians, and Mestizo. This history that acknowledges a very early brown population in California and stories of early migrations might actually foster a sense of belonging among the huge Mestizo community in Southern and Central California. But it's ignored and an opportunity lost. In only a few cases do the mission narratives discuss ethnicity, and when they do, they inevitably frame elites as white Europeans and soldiers and settlers as Mexicans. As Mexico did not exist prior to 1821, and at the time was merely southern New Spain, it is erroneous and misleading to call the colonizing body Mexican. It's even more misleading, however, to frame them as Spaniards, which creates the illusion that they were European or white. The census of 1790 suggests that soldiers, farmers, and their families brought to establish nearby pueblos were primarily Cochimi and Mayo Indians and mixed heritage people of Indian and African parentage. So the modes of representation at the missions follow two tracks. One that's entire obliteration, and one that is more celebratory in this idea of progress. But even in the narratives of progress, there's a decline, right? Because by the end of the tour, there are no native people, so eventually they're gone. So in some cases, in the obliteration mode, they're gone almost immediately, and in this other mode, they survive to help build the missions and to work on California ranches, but then they disappear from the narrative. So the obliteration narrative is characterized by just haphazard, as you saw in that last picture, haphazard display of artifacts, no historic context. There's just basically materials on the floors, and in these cases, dusty cases with bugs in them, and then in contrast, there are these well-lit cases with the opulent, vestments and accoutrement for Catholic ceremony, in contrast with that and that. The second mode of exhibition, this progress narrative, also static, glorified, pre-contact native life, and going in that same proscribed trajectory, starting with the celebration of the beautiful coastal native life, but ending in a celebration of Catholicism and the missions and the missions themselves, right? The preservation of the missions and the continuation of the Spanish fantasy heritage. Within these two tracks, there are 4 rhetorical strategies that are employed, and I unpack these using a book called Representations of Slavery. And so, and in Representations of Slavery, Eichstätt and Small's book, they speak about the way that plantation museums are laid out, and I borrowed from them these rhetorical strategies that fit very well with the mission narratives. Oftentimes this rhetorical strategy to, if they portray Native people in mission life, they're either as resistors, bad Indians who wouldn't comply, or builders, helpers. In this case, Pascuala was an informant. She let the priests know that there was going to be a revolt, and so the soldiers were able to stop the revolt before it got too out of hand. And Pascuala's story is the only representation of Native life at Santa Ynez beyond the glorified pre-contact history. Segregated knowledge is when the Indian story is told, but it's told in a different place entirely. And 3 of the missions actually did this, where they had a different room that had the Indian stuff. So Native people are sort of a separate story from the mission story. And then relative inclusion, really only one fit neatly in this category, and that was Mission Santa Barbara. However, so they do work with Chumash community members in Santa Barbara to, actually there's some contemporary art in the final space on the mission tour, and a little sign that says "We're still here." And so while it's not really incorporation or inclusion, at least they are talking to living Indian people and are taking their concerns into consideration. Mission La Purísima also works with the Santa Ynez tribe and has developed a nice little exhibit in their visitor center, but they too, like segregated knowledge, are off the museum path. So there's 30 acres of mission buildings and all of this interpretive material. And this place you only really visit if you have to go to the bathroom. And this is just a graph that shows how they fall. So I did, I really dug into the mission research, as you can see, because those representations are so problematic, is a kind way to put it. So in the final analysis of that work, the dissertation work, how am I doing on time, Maria?
15 minutes.
Okay.
It's over.
Okay, I have 15 minutes?
Yeah, 15 minutes, but it's time for questions.
Okay, good. Well, not so good, because it means I'm going to have to go pretty fast. Anyway, the final analysis was that the museums on the Central Coast are relying upon outdated histories to inform their exhibits, essentially, and all of their programming. And so without meaningful engagement with local people, they're telling a story that is really outdated and really misrepresentative, right? And they almost never tell a story into the present, and so they inadvertently, whether they believe they're doing this or not, they literally erase Native people in the here and now. Many claim to be updating exhibits, and I've seen, since this research, I've seen that some of them actually are, and more today are consulting Native communities. Some of the people in my community have actually used my dissertation as a tool to be heard. Like, this is what's happening in this museum, and that was my goal. And unfortunately, it's a dissertation, and so hopefully by the time I'm done at SAR, it'll be on its way to being a book, and they can take a published manuscript into these museums and missions to make their point. But the goal was to have a substantial, grounded study that proved what we already knew, that they're really misrepresenting us and leaving us in the past, and that these sites are, in some cases, because Native people are missing from popular media, entirely, right? There's no TV shows about Native people. There rarely a movie comes out about contemporary Native people, living Native people. People learn about Native American life from museums, and in California, it's part of the state curriculum. And so 3rd and 4th grade, busloads and busloads of these kids are being indoctrinated to believe that we're gone. We believe it has an impact on our life. And there's these unrealistic expectations of who we are when they do encounter a living, especially when a child encounters a living Chumash person. We don't fit the model the only model that they've ever seen. And these ideas about, distinct groups of California, California Indians versus the Spanish settlers. What we know now is that there have been people moving up and down the Pacific coast for thousands of years, and that the people who came north were primarily those Native people from those communities that had been colonized a generation before. And so that is it's a problematic narrative to divide us from our relatives in the South, right? Because there's a border there now. And that border and that ideology informs these narratives. These narratives have an impact on us today. There's a reason why there's no federally recognized groups in that Indian-free zone. And part of it might be due to the fact that it's the most expensive real estate in North America, right? I'm sure that has an impact. And it may have an impact on what museums are telling as well, because the wealthiest landed people in those communities are the ones who sit on the boards of those organizations. So no conspiracy theory here, but there is evidence to suggest that there's that there's an alienation that is occurring as a result of these narratives. So unfortunately, I'll have to speed through some of the more beautiful things that are happening now, but these alternative narratives, which I discuss only in the last chapter of the dissertation, are really going to make up a third of the manuscript, talking about the ways that Native people along the central coast of California, really all throughout California, are engaged in different forms of cultural revitalization. The Chumash community built and paddled a canoe for the first time in 150 years across the Santa Barbara Channel in 2001, and since then have been paddling across the channel every year on that same weekend. And this past year, there were 3 canoes in the water. So, and as a result of that revitalization alone, bringing the canoe back, our young people are used to these gatherings now. And more people are speaking our language. More and more of those young people are interested in learning how to weave. It's beautiful and quite miraculous, given that there isn't a land base and there aren't resources to mobilize. This is completely grassroots, and here they are in 2008. And for those of you that know, the Santa Barbara Channel is a shipping lane. There's a shipping lane, so it's a rather treacherous waters. It's open water, and they're out there in these plank canoes called tamuls, and and our young men aren't as muscular and fit as they were back in the day either. And so anyway, it's miraculous and a beautiful thing to witness. So as I said, there were future directions that were outlined in the dissertation, and many of those I'm actually employing now. So it was important for me to not leave the work where it was. Yes, this is the problem, and these are the missing narratives, but to take it a step further. And so much of that is what I'll be doing here. Chapters 6 through 9 will be looking at these ongoing traumatic or microaggressions that continue to occur, including fiesta celebrations, which we also have in Santa Barbara, and reconquest performances, which are also very popular in California. You know, the fact that Junipero Serra was just made a saint a couple of years ago. These things have been really difficult on my community. As we're revitalizing and, you know, really making an effort to come back, there seems to be some pressure in the opposite direction. And one of those is actually, one of those, so I've already sort of gone over this, but these are sort of the waves of revitalization that have occurred over the last 40 years, almost 50 years. And that reconnecting with our relatives to the south is something that, you know, for the longest time, people wouldn't acknowledge that we had any connection to Mexico or Mexican Indians. So much racism, and we see that shifting now. People starting to really own and identify with their California heritage, even though that heritage means that our own bodies are sites of conflict, right? We are the colonizer and the colonized, embedded in one body. Embracing that history and recognizing, I think that we can't heal as a people until we recognize our whole history. So the most recent effort underway that feels sort of oppositional is the California Missions Foundation's petition to make the El Camino Real, so the road that connected all of the Baja and Alta California missions, making that road a UNESCO World Heritage corridor, which is an incredible opportunity to reconnect us with our southern relatives and to acknowledge that movement up and down that road for millennia. However, because it's being driven by the California Missions Foundation, it's celebrating conquest. It's celebrating the arrival of Spain to North America. And so it's unfortunate because their goals are really missing some of the most important and incredibly deep histories. So there's quite a resistance to this effort, and just as there's resistance to the Serra statues and the missions overall, the people on the resistance side are basically saying that this is going to further obscure our history, it further disenfranchise us, it celebrates the mission system. However, if in my opinion, and several tribal leaders in California are of this mind, that the UNESCO World Heritage designation could potentially bring attention to our history, right? If we are brought to the table, or if it's our goals that are prioritized in the process. And so we've got a process underway to sort of retake it. If it's going to be acknowledged as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's going to be acknowledged as such because the Native people, for the fact that for millennia it's been our trade route. And we really believe that by doing that not only are they no longer doing harm, but they're actually working with us to heal these past harms, right? Much like like Auschwitz is used as a site of conscience, the UNESCO World Heritage Site along the El Camino Real could also be a site of conscience. So complicating the history, right? Not making it this very clear, you know, for ethnic era story, but complicating and telling it as it really is from our perspectives. And in doing so too, acknowledge the diversity, the biological diversity of that place, and acknowledging that the only border that meant anything to us for thousands of years was the one between the earth and the sea, right? And it was such an important corridor. It was such an important source of life. It's why there was such abundant indigenous life there in the first place. So some of the things we've done so far are we've developed a website. It's not launched yet. We're still populating it, but it'll contain a digital archive, access for our researchers as well as teachers. And also we've got 18 digital stories, a project that I conducted while I was at the University of Washington that collected first-person narratives that'll live on this site. And you'll be able to go to a village site and click on it and hear a living person telling their story. And then the effort overall is, the first thing we're doing is renaming it. So from El Camino Real to our road, or the place the road we travel when we trade, in our indigenous languages. So it'll have, in each region, it'll have a different name. And in the Chumash region, it's Kiach Alayash, which is essentially the road that connects us. So renaming, reclaiming, remapping. We're in the middle of writing a California Humanities grant, developing the website. We have this archive of digital stories. We're proposing to do a couple of exhibitions, one in Mexico and 3 in Alta, California. And we're even talking about and talking with people who have the technology to do this, but to podcasts and GPS or GIS. So you could essentially drive along the road and listen to the stories of the people who occupied different areas of the road. And not just indigenous stories, but stories of all of the people who have shared that road, but just not privileging the mission narrative. So I completely diverted from my 18-page paper here, probably is a good thing. But I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear some of your questions or comments. This is a work in progress, obviously, and so I don't have it all wrapped up and tidy just yet, but I'm excited about where it's going, and I'm so grateful for this 9 months to really think about these things and to communicate with my community on next steps.
I just want to thank you for your
Thank you.